Hello everyone. Welcome to the short introduction to Heumer's essay, America's Unjust Drug War. As always, this is a short introduction and there's a lot of material in the essay which you'll need to read in order to properly understand. When thinking about Michael Heumer's essay, there are two main elements to keep in mind. First is the claim that the traditional arguments for keeping drugs illegal are bad arguments. This is a negative claim. The second element that we want to keep in mind is the claim that there are good reasons to think that drug use should be legal. This is a positive claim. Now let's take a second to think about what that means. Negative claims or negative arguments are arguments which seek to prove that a particular claim or a particular idea is false. So if I would like to prove that traditional arguments for drug use are bad, I am going to launch a negative argument. Positive arguments seek to prove that a particular claim is true or a particular position is right. So if I want to argue that there is a good reason to make drugs legal, for example, stemming from personal autonomy, that I am launching a positive argument. So we want to be clear that his essay is divided into two separate endeavors. At first he launches some negative arguments, and then he launches some positive arguments. Let's take a look at the negative arguments first. He begins the section with negative arguments by looking at the first traditional argument in favor of the prohibition against legalized drug use. In other words, there's two traditional arguments that are used when arguing that drugs should be kept illegal. And Michael Heumer is going to try to show that these arguments are bad arguments. So the first traditional argument in favor of prohibition is that drugs should be outlawed because of the harm that they cause to the users. So using drugs such as marijuana, heroin, cocaine, meth, LSD, etc., is an activity, using drugs is an activity which is really harmful to the drug user, and therefore we should keep them illegal. Now Michael Heumer will argue that this argument has two especially dubious elements. The first dubious element is that the argument assumes that it's the government's job to keep you from harming yourself. Well, if it's the government's job to keep you from harming yourself, there seems to be a lot of things that the government will make illegal that are in fact legal. Smoking, skydiving, driving, etc., etc. The second dubious assumption that is used in that first traditional argument is that illegal drugs are especially or uniquely harmful. Yes, some illegal drugs are very harmful, but not all of them. So even if this argument is a good one, even if the argument against personal harm is a good one, it would only argue for outlawing some drugs, not all drugs. Second, there are lots of really harmful drugs, or drugs that are just as harmful as the illegal drugs. There are plenty of prescription medication, which is extremely harmful, and even non-prescription medication, such as aspirin, or non-prescription mood-altering substances such as alcohol, are perfectly legal, and even though we know they're harmful and even fatal, right? So the idea is that if either of these two counter arguments are right, then the traditional argument for one of the traditional arguments in favor of prohibition would be on shaky ground. The second traditional argument in favor of prohibition, or in support of prohibition, is that drugs should be outlawed because of the harm they cause to people other than the drug user. In other words, while a drug user is harming himself, or may not be harming himself, when you use drugs, you very often tend to act in antisocial ways, which leads to harm to the people around you, your family, your friends, your colleagues, etc. Michael Heumer points out that, however, many of the harmful behaviors which are said to be the result of drug use, or which are said to justify drug use, such as being extremely lazy or being unwilling to continue working at a particular job or at any job, None of these behaviors are illegal in themselves. In fact, anyone can do all of the various harmful things that drugs are said to lead to without being arrested for doing those harmful things. So, marijuana is supposed to be harmful because it makes you lazy and this is bad for society. But being lazy isn't illegal. Not having a job isn't illegal. Being antisocial isn't illegal. And if marijuana is supposed to be illegal only because it leads to those behaviors, then exactly why is marijuana illegal? It seems to be unclear. So again, we have these two traditional arguments that drugs are harmful to the user and or harmful to society, and Michael Heumer is trying to show that those arguments fail to make the case that drugs should be illegal. Now, I mentioned that he has negative and positive arguments, and we've just looked at the negative arguments, so let's look at the positive arguments. And these are Michael Heumer's attempts to show that, in fact, drug use should be legal. So we just looked at Michael Heumer's attempt to show that laws against drug use are bad, right? Or that the support for those laws are bad. Now we'll look at some positive claims, some attempts to show that, in fact, drug use should be legal. The first one is that prohibition violates an individual's right to control their own body. In other words, or generally speaking, we have the right to use our own bodies as we see fit. I have a right to do whatever I want with my body. You have a right to do whatever you want with your body. And as long as we're not using our bodies to harm anyone else, or as long as we're not harming anyone else while we're doing whatever we want with our own bodies, then we're not doing anything wrong. Well, of course, plenty of drug use involves changes or certain events or feelings that are sort of contained within my own skin and within a drug user's own skin, and you can use drugs without ever harming anyone else. And so it looks like what in philosophy we call the right of autonomy. In other words, the right to control yourself and to do what you want to do seems to be a very strong argument in favor of legalizing drug use. The next positive argument in favor of legalizing drug use is that the war on drugs has caused an enormous amount of damage to individual lives and cost society an immense amount of money. The single largest body of incarcerated felons are non-violent drug users. So, even if we think that there is something wrong with drug use, even if we think that drug use ought to be illegal, can we justify the cost of the drug war? In other words, it's entirely possible for you to think that drugs ought to be illegal, but to also think that America's war on drugs is really bad and that maybe we should be doing something different, something better, something more effective, something less harmful. So in a sense, Michael Heumer has done two things. Try to argue that typical justifications against or in favor of making drugs illegal are bad justifications, and also try to argue that there are good reasons to think that drug use should be legal. This concludes the introduction to Michael Heumer's essay, America's Unjust War on Drugs. I hope that it has helped orient you and given you a good context for the essay reading and for your homework assignments. Thank you for listening, and contact me, as always, if you have any questions.